The committee appreciates the testimony from all the members, and Representative McClintock, we're going to give you 5 minutes. The floor is yours, and thank you for being with us this morning.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. All spending originates in the House. In a very real sense, the buck starts here. The government cannot spend a single dollar unless the House says it can spend that dollar. The 1974 Budget Act gives the House a very powerful set of tools to control spending and balance the budget. For years on the House Budget Committee, I've heard it said that the budget's merely an aspirational document offering our vision of the direction the government should take. That's simply not true. The budget is an operational document, the single most important tool that we have to control spending. The problem is we don't use it. I've also heard incessantly that it's the mandatory spending that's to blame, and that's beyond our control. Well, mandatory spending is out of control, but it is a lot easier to change than discretionary spending because the reconciliation bill gets expedited consideration in the Senate. The appropriation bills do not. The budget resolution sets limits on the discretionary spending that's appropriated annually. That's about 1/3 of our budget. It also limits the mandatory spending that's set by statute. That's about 2/3 of our budget. And it gives us powerful tools to enforce both sets of limits. The problem is we don't use them. Why? Well, the first problem is on the discretionary side. Those limits are sent to the House Appropriations Committee, which cannot exceed them. The House routinely meets this responsibility. The Senate does not, because its dysfunctional cloture rule gives a minority the ability to block them. As the deadline approaches and the threat of a government shutdown looms, the appropriation bills are cast aside in favor of stopgap measures that continue the spending trajectory without serious reform. Now, that's easy to fix. Give appropriation bills the same expedited consideration in the Senate that the reconciliation bill already has. The bigger problem is on the mandatory side, and process reform is not going to fix it. The mandatory limits are supposed to be placed in reconciliation instructions that are sent to the House authorizing committees. Those committees are then required to make conforming statutory changes. If the committees fail to act, the Budget Committee can do so directly. Either way, those statutory changes go into a single reconciliation bill that bypasses cloture. But this powerful process is never used. Why? Well, because decisions on reforming mandatory spending, mainly entitlement programs, are the most difficult decisions in our fiscal policy. It's easier not to make them and blame the process. Every year, the House Budget Committee produces a budget that it claims will balance in 10 years, and it lays out proposals on how to do it. But it never places these proposals in the reconciliation instructions that transform them from promise into action. This year's budget's case in point. It promises mandatory spending reforms to balance within 10 years, but only places 5% of those reforms into reconciliation instructions that will actually change spending. In other words, we're 5% serious about balancing the budget and 95% unserious. If we were serious about the mandatory reforms, we'd put them in the reconciliation instructions and force the statutory changes necessary to make them. We would also include discretionary limits that we begin the trajectory back to balance in this year's spending. Fact is, we didn't. With all due respect, that makes this committee's work largely a fool's errand. The principal problem with the budget process is that it requires very hard decisions. Changing the process isn't going to make these decisions any easier. Whatever the process, the decisions are going to get harder and harder every year that we don't make them. Let me close with a warning. Countries that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long. Debt the size that we're now carrying ends up either as a fiscal crisis like those paralyzing Venezuela and our own territory of Puerto Rico, or as an economic crisis as the central bank buys up debt at the expense of economic growth, as we're seeing in Japan and throughout Europe. Over the past 10 years, while population has increased 26%, our revenues have more than kept pace. They've grown 29%. But spending has grown 46%. In short, It's the spending stupid. Our job is to control that spending. We have powerful tools to do so, but we have not used them. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings.
Thank the gentleman from California for his testimony this morning.